Namaste. The bowing of me and you. Hopefully to something greater than both of us. Meanwhile, he asks what a sequence of mutations is by saying, "What now is this?" 33. The positive correlate to the moment, recognized as such, that the final limit of the mutation is a sequence. And we've been talking about karma, and it's not really that karma disappears, it's that this incessant point counting and all that other stuff, it's not about cause and effect anymore. Your true will unassuaged of purpose, as it has been said. And when was this? I guess it was before this book was written, 1927. The sequence of the mutation is that which has its moment as its positive correlate. It is that to which the moments are related, say, living in the moment, but not in a heedless sort of way. It is that in which the accumulation of moments inheres. This is the meaning, and a sequence can never be explained unless there be that which the sequence contains. Neither can there be a sequence of only a single moment. Therefore, the remaining alternative is that in which the accumulation of moments inheres, as he says in the words, a continuous series of moments. He gives the source of the valid idea for the sequence of the mutation by saying, of the mutation. The final limit or termination of the mutation is the absurd fact that even a new garment, although kept with care, after a time looks old. So then there is a sequence of the mutation, and before this point is reached, the successive stages of oldness, the slightest, very slight, noticeable, more noticeable, most noticeable, are inferred already to exist. This same he sets forth by a negative argument in the words, for when. The words unless, as passed through, refer to an oldness in which a particular moment in the sequence has not been reached. The objector says, such a sequence is impossible in the case of primary matter, since that is permanent. In reply to this, he says, in permanent things also. By the use of the plural, he asserts that the sequence is to be found among all permanent things. As to this, he shows first what the different kinds of permanent things are, and then explains how the sequence is found among permanent things in the words two kinds. The objector says, the absolutely unchanging, because it does not swerve from its own nature, may be concluded to be permanent. But how can that which is in mutation, which unceasingly swerves from its own nature, be permanent? In reply to this, he says, when. The being behind the mind and the body and all that is the permanent, right? External aspects and time variations and intensities, of these it is the nature to rise and fall. But for a substance, there is no dislodging it from its essential nature. At this question, whether all the sequences are cognizable at the final limit of mutation, he says no. Of these two, with regard to the external aspects of the aspects, guna, the thinking substance, and the others, for example, since it has reached the end, because of the destruction of the properties, therefore the sequence is cognizable at the end of the mutation. In the case of the primary cause, however, the sequence of mutations does not reach an end. The objector says, since the original substance undergoes mutation in the form of external aspects, it may have a sequence of mutation. But how can the self, who does not enter into the mutation, have a sequence of mutation? In reply to this, he says, with regard to the absolutely unchanging permanent, persons who are in bondage because they assume that they are not over and above mind stuff, have the mutations of this mind stuff attributed to them. And in the case of the liberated, a mutation based upon the mere act of existence and having no material existence is wrongly predicated. Since it is a word only, if we say that the liberated exist, which comes first, predicate relation which follows is based on the act of existence only and on nothing more, when he says from the act of existence. As to the aspects guna, it has been said that their sequence and mutation reaches no end, not enduring this, someone acts now. The words in equilibrium mean in the condition of a great mundane dissolution. In emotion means at the time of creation. What he means to say is this: if owing to endlessness there is no end of the mutations of the round of existence, why then, sir, how, at the time of a great mundane dissolution, could it suddenly for all selves cease? And how, at the time of the beginning of a creation, could the round of existences suddenly be produced? Accordingly, in a sequence of liberations of the self, one by one, because all of them would be set free in a sequence of rounds of rebirths, all of these rounds of rebirths would be destroyed. That is, would reach a final consummation of the mutations of the primary cause. And hopefully your primary cause is the right cause, right? Orthodoxy, orthopraxy, as it would be called. And if this be so, the primary cause itself would prove to be impermanent, inasmuch also as you are not willing to admit that quite a new principle should come forth. You cannot say that the mutations are endless, for if that be so, beginninglessness would be contradicted, and one would be involved in breaking of all the statements of the books. Shastra. This is the point. He gives the reply in the words, "This is incapable of answer." This contention does not deserve a reply. In order to show that it is absolutely incapable of an answer, he shows that there is a question absolutely capable of an answer by saying, the question is, will everyone who is born die? He gives the answer by saying, yes, sir. In other words, assuredly, sir. Having asked a question which admits only one answer, he asks a question which admits of alternative answers in the words, will everyone. He shows how it is that this admits of several answers in the words, alternative answers. He gives another question which also admits of alternative answers, and which makes the meaning clear in the words, likewise, the human race. But this is incapable of an absolute answer, for it is not possible to say absolutely, and in general, whether the round of rebirth of fortunate and unfortunate persons has an end or not, just as we cannot ascertain absolutely the blissfulness or lack of blissfulness in the case of all living beings. This cannot be asserted with the same absolute certainty as the certainty that all who are born will die. But the question is capable of answer in alternative ways, as he says, for the fortunate being. What he intends is this. The inference is that when there's a series of liberations, all would be liberated, and the round of rebirths would be cut short. Now this inference is based on the liberation established by the sacred tradition, agama. So how can the fact of the validity of the sacred tradition that establishes the liberation, which we assume, invalidate the same sacred tradition with reference to the permanence of all effects of the primary cause? Well, sometimes the tradition is not as preserved as people would hope. Therefore, this inference, the object of which runs counter to the sacred tradition, is not the source of a valid idea, for it is taught in the sacred word and the tradition and the legends and the Puranas that the succession of creations and resolutions, pratistarga, is without beginning and without end. And so, first of all, in the case of all the selves, Atman, a simultaneous destruction of the round of rebirths is not possible, for even learned men are not grounded in discriminative discernment, although it is to be required by the toils of study and a sequence of many births. By births, I mean, changes in who you are. Becoming new in certain ways, repenting, as some may call it. How much less than all living creatures in general, both animate and inanimate and so on, suddenly at one time. For if causes are not simultaneous, effects should not be simultaneous. But discriminative discernment occurs in a sequence, and when numberless beings are liberated in a sequence, there is no destruction of the round of rebirth, for living beings are endless in number, because they are countless. Thus all is cleared up. Well, you think that a god would know, but from our perspective, a lot of things are countless. Even with our modern science, we realize we know less and less of what's going on the more we know. Isolation is said to follow after the sequence of the tax of the aspects guna has been completed. The nature of this is defined. 34. Isolation is the inverse generation of the aspects, no longer provided with the purpose by the self. Art is the energy of intellect grounded in itself. Now, inversion, aversion, adversion, various things like that. It's like, well, sometimes these are processes that people have to go through, and it's not good or bad. These aren't good or bad terms in themselves, but when the aspects, guna, whose essence is causes and effects, are inversely generated, now that experience and liberation have been accomplished for the self, and now that a purpose is no longer provided by the self, this is isolation. The self's energy of thought becomes isolated, since it is grounded in itself, and is not again related to the sattva of the thinking substance. Its continuance, thus forevermore, is isolation. In the Patanjalan, authoritative book on yoga, the exposition of the Samkhya, the book on isolation, the fourth, is over, and here's the comment here. The subordinate connections of the sutra, whose purpose is to determine the nature of isolation. With other topics, he gives in the words task of the aspects. 34. Isolation is the inverse generation of the aspects no longer provided with the purpose by the self, or it is the energy of intellect grounded in itself. Insofar as their work is done, the aspects no longer provided with the purpose by the self are inversely generated. They are resolved in their cause, which is the primary cause, pradhana, of the aspects, whose essence is causes and effects. The subliminal impressions of the restriction of emergent concentration are resolved in the central organ, and the central organ into the personality substance, and the personality substance into resoluble primary matter, and resoluble primary matter into unresolvable primary matter. This resolution, pratisarga, of the aspects guna, whose essence is cause and effects, is isolation, the release of some self from the primary cause. Our release is the self, grounded in itself. As he says, grounded in itself. For the energy of thought, even in great mundane dissolution, is grounded in itself. But that is not release, so he says again, the word itte in the sutra signifies the completion of the authoritative work. In this book, it has been described first the mind stuff fit for release, then the perfections of the other world, then of external objects and the knower, jñā, the cloud of knowable things, concentration, and the two kinds of release, and incidentally other things. There has also been a description of the source of anguishes, and anguishes themselves have been recounted. Here Also, the 2 kinds of yoga with the 8 aids to yoga have been set forth. The path of release, the distinction between the aspects and the self, has been made more clear. Isolation has been discriminated, and the intellect has been made free of the anguishes. An explanation of the comment on Patanjali's yoga treatise, which explanation is entitled Clarification of the Entities, Tattva Va'etcharade, and which was composed by the Venerable Vachas Patimitra. The Book of Isolation, the 4th, is finished, and there's a whole series of works referred to here. I guess 1834 to 1912 works. They have the words listed. That occur in the sutras. It might have served well for them to have included a transliteration of the sutras, but so we finished that there. And if you need to go back to watch any of the other videos in this series or any other series, if you feel like watching one and not the others, that's fine too. Comment and question. And I'm not on Facebook, so feel free to share any of my content on that. But it's not about me. It's about the material at hand. It's about sharing, experiencing together. Namaste. I and you pray. Hopefully not to each other. Right?